In 1933, a labourer working on a bridge over the Songhua River in northeastern China pulled a skull out of the ground. It was enormous, heavy, wrong in a way he could not name. It did not look like the skull of anyone he had ever met, and it did not look like the skulls in any book. He was working under Japanese occupation, and he did not trust the people who would have taken it from him. So he did something almost no one in the history of science has ever done with a fossil this important. He hid it. He wrapped it, carried it home, and lowered it into the bottom of a well. And there it stayed, in the dark, under the water, in total silence, for the rest of his life. He told almost no one. He did not give it up during the war. He did not give it up after. It was only as an old man near the end that he finally told his family what was down there. The skull came back into the light in 2018, 85 years in a well. When scientists finally got their hands on it, they realised they were not looking at a strange modern human, and they were not looking at a Neanderthal. They were looking at something with a brain as large as ours, a brow like a thick ledge of bone, a face wide and strong enough to belong to a creature built for a world far harder than this one. In 2021, a team formally described it as a new species and gave it a name out of mythology. They called it Homo longi, Dragon Man. And then, in the summer of 2025, they did something that had never been done before in the entire history of this field. They scraped a few flecks of fossilized dental plaque off its teeth, pulled ancient genetic material out of that hardened grime, and matched it against the genome of a population of ancient humans that, until that moment, had no face at all. A population science had known about for 15 years only as a fingertip, a tooth, and a few broken scraps of bone. The match came back clean. For the first time, humanity was looking directly into the face of a Denisovan. Everything you're about to hear comes back to that. We did not find these other humans in a tomb, or a temple, or a triumphant chapter of the history books. We found one of them in a well. We found another inside a finger bone. We found another inside our own blood. They were never as gone as we were told. The world 45,000 years ago was not empty. It was not a clean stage waiting for us to walk onto it. It was occupied. In the caves of Europe, there were people who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years before our ancestors arrived. People who had outlived ice ages, who lit fires in the dark long before we did, who buried at least some of their dead and pressed pigment onto things for reasons we still argue about. In the mountains and high deserts of Asia, there were the people whose face we would not see for another 50,000 years, the ones from the well, surviving on a frozen plateau so high and so brutal that most humans alive today could not walk across it without their bodies failing. On an island in Indonesia, there were humans the size of a modern 6-year-old, with brains no bigger than a chimpanzee's, hunting dwarf elephants with stone-tipped spears in a sealed-off world that had quietly rewritten their biology over 500,000 years. And deep in a cave system in South Africa, down through cracks so narrow that an adult has to exhale to pass, there were the bones of yet another kind of human. A third the size brain, hands made for climbing, feet made for walking, stacked in the dark in arrangements that nobody has fully explained to this day. We were not the first humans, and we were not the second, and we were not the fifth. For most of the time there have been creatures you could reasonably call human. We were not the only ones. We were one branch on a crowded tree, and for a long, strange stretch of deep time, we were a minor one. Tonight is the story of the others, who they were, what they built, how they vanished, and the part of the story that has only sharpened in the last 2 years, as the laboratories have caught up with the bones. The part where you find out that vanished was never the right word. Because the honest version of this story does not end with us standing alone. It ends with us realising we never were. There is a picture in your head right now. You did not choose it. It was put there. It is the march of progress. A knuckle-walking ape on the left, then a hunched, shadowy thing, then something straightening up, losing its hair, lifting its chin, and finally, on the right, a modern human, striding forward, fully upright, the finished product. A staircase climbing out of the animal and arriving inevitably at us. It is one of the most successful pieces of visual storytelling ever made. It is on t-shirts and textbook covers and 1,000 internet jokes, and as a description of how we came to exist, it is almost entirely wrong. Evolution did not build a ladder with us at the top. It grew a bush a tangled, branching, messy bush, with shoots that split off and ran side by side for hundreds of thousands of years, some withering, some flowering, some growing, back into each other long after they had separated. There was no single file line. There was no inevitable arrival. There was a wild, overgrown family, and at many points in the last 2 million years, several different kinds of human were alive on this planet at exactly the same time. Not metaphorically at the same time. Literally. Sharing continents, walking the same valleys, hunting the same herds, sheltering in some cases in the very same caves, separated only by the centuries. How many kinds of human have there been? That is a genuinely unsettled question, and it is unsettled for an honest reason. Nobody fully agrees on where one species ends and the next begins when all you have to work with is a jaw here, a thigh bone there, a scatter of teeth. Count conservatively, and you land somewhere around 8 or 9 distinct species in our genus, Homo. Count more finely, and the people who study Asia in particular are now counting more finely, and the number climbs. The last 2 years alone have seen serious scientists arguing for the addition of brand new species to that list, drawn from bones that had been sitting in drawers, misclassified, for half a century. What is not in dispute is the headline. Our own species, Homo sapiens, is roughly 300,000 years old, and for at least half of that existence, quite possibly much more, we shared the earth with other humans. Different humans. Humans who are not our ancestors but our contemporaries, cousins, not grandparents, alive while we were alive. We are not used to thinking about this, and the reason is simple and a little eerie. We are the only ones left to think about it. Every other branch is gone, so when we look around and see only ourselves, we mistake the silence for the natural order of things. We assume being the only human is what being human means. It is not. It is a recent condition. On the time scale of our genus, it is practically breaking news. For the overwhelming majority of the human story, the word human was plural. So the question this whole story keeps circling back to is not, how did we evolve? That question has 1,000 documentaries. The question is the one almost nobody answers honestly, the one that gets harder the more closely you look at it. If there were so many of us, so many kinds of us, why is there only one kind left? To even begin to answer that, you have to meet them. Not as captions on a diagram, as characters, as populations that lived and adapted and held on, sometimes for spans of time that make our own run look like an afternoon. We will start with the one that makes our run look the shortest of all, the traveller, the survivor, the one who held the record for 2 million years. Start with a number, and let it sit there until it becomes uncomfortable. 2 million years. That is, very roughly, how long Homo erectus existed on this planet. They appear in Africa around 2 million years ago, and the youngest fossils that may belong to them, from a site called Ngandong on the island of Java, date to somewhere in the neighbourhood of 110,000 years ago. Stretch those endpoints out and you get a species that persisted, in one form or another, for the better part of 2 million years. Now hold our own number up next to it. Homo sapiens, 300,000 years, and most of that spent as small scattered bands in Africa, going nowhere, doing, by the standards of what came later, not very much. Homo erectus lasted somewhere around 6 or 7 times longer than we have managed so far. If endurance is the measure of success, they were not just more successful than us. It is not close, and they did not spend those 2 million years sitting still. Homo erectus was the first human species to walk out of Africa in real numbers, and they did not stop walking. They spread across the Caucasus, they reached the cold edges of Europe, they went deep into Asia, they turn up in what is now Georgia, in China, in Indonesia. They are by a wide margin the most geographically successful human species that has ever existed, including us, until very, very recently. They walked into deserts and adapted. They walked into forests and adapted. They walked into cold and adapted. They reached the southern islands of Indonesia, places you cannot get to on foot, which means that at some point this species was either crossing open water deliberately or being carried across it by accident often enough to colonize the far side. We are still arguing about how. Their toolkit tells you something about the kind of mind they had. Homo erectus is associated with the Acheulean hand axe, a teardrop of worked stone, symmetrical on both faces, clearly shaped to a mental template rather than just bashed into usefulness. It is a real piece of design. And here is the strange part. That design barely changed for over 1 million years. The same basic tool made the same basic way, across continents, across an unimaginable depth of time. To us, raised on technology that becomes obsolete in 18 months, that looks like a failure of imagination. Look at it another way, and it is something else entirely. It is a solution so good that it did not need improving for longer than our entire species has been alive. It is stability on a scale we genuinely cannot feel. They almost certainly used fire, and not just by stumbling into it. They kept it. They carried it. They depended on it. They were tall, long-legged, built much more like us than like anything that came before them. Their brains were smaller than ours, but far larger than their predecessors. And inside those skulls something had clearly shifted. This was a creature that planned, that ranged, that moved through the world with intent. And then, after nearly 2 million years, they were gone. Here is what their disappearance actually means, and it is not a comfortable thought. It is not really a story about them at all. It is a question about us. A way of life persisted on this planet for almost 2 million years. Evolution produced something that durable, that adaptable, that geographically unstoppable, and then it ended. So when we tell ourselves the flattering story, the one where we won because we were special, Homo erectus is the inconvenient witness standing at the back of the room. Because by any measure they could see at the time, they were the special ones. They were the apex experiment. They were the thing that worked. What changed? What did we have or do or get lucky with? Yet, that 2 million years of staggering success could not. We are going to come back to that question from several directions, and the answer, when we finally reach it, is not the comfortable one. Before we move on, look at how raw and unfinished our knowledge of even this, the longest-lived human species, still is. In 2022, in a cave called Cima del Elefante in the Atapuerca Mountains of northern Spain, excavators pulled out a set of shattered bone fragments. It took 2 years of painstaking reconstruction, with 3D imaging to realise what they had. Most of the left side of an adult human face. They nicknamed the individual Pink. And when the work was published in the journal Nature in 2025, the dating landed somewhere between 1.1 and 1.4 million years ago. That makes Pink the oldest human face ever found in Western Europe, pushing the known human presence on that side of the continent deeper into the past than the evidence had previously allowed. Pink did not slot neatly into any existing box, which by now should sound familiar. The face was too primitive, too forward-projecting, the nose too flat, to be the slender-faced Homo antecessor that had been the oldest known European before. The researchers reached cautiously for a careful label, Homo affinis erectus, meaning in effect, related to erectus, an erectus-grade human, but we will not pretend to be more certain than the bones allow. 1 million+ years old, the first known face of Western Europe, and described for the first time only last year, from fragments that sat in the ground until 2022 and took until 2025 to speak. That is the actual condition of this science, not a finished mural. A few recovered tiles, most of the wall still blank, and the whole picture jolting sideways every time a new tile comes out of the dirt. For now, just understand the scale of what we are talking about. Before there was anyone to remember it, there was an empire of humans that spanned 3 continents and lasted longer than the mind can hold. It rose, it endured almost beyond comprehension, and it fell, and nobody who was there to see the end could read or write or carve a record of it. The only reason we know it existed at all is that they left their bones and their beautiful, unchanging stone lying in the ground for us to find, and that, more than 1 million years later, we are still finding them, still rebuilding their faces out of fragments, still being surprised. There is a moment in this story that no fossil captures cleanly, and it is one of the most important moments in the history of our family. It is the moment the road forked. Between the long reign of Homo erectus and the appearance of the humans you actually know the names of, us, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, there is a thick, blurry, fiercely debated band of populations that connect them. The label most often hung on this band is Homo heidelbergensis, named for a jawbone found near Heidelberg, Germany, more than a century ago. Whether heidelbergensis is one species or a loose bag of several, whether the African ones and the European ones belong together at all, paleoanthropologists will argue about this in a way that becomes genuinely heated. and we are not going to pretend that argument is settled, because it is not. But strip away the naming fight and something simple and powerful is left, and it matters more than the label. Somewhere between 700,000 and 300,000 years ago, roughly, there were populations of large-brained, big-game-hunting humans living across Africa and Europe, and possibly into Asia. They made sophisticated tools, they hunted cooperatively, which means they planned together and communicated in ways more complex than anything we have evidence for earlier. At one extraordinary site in Germany, a set of wooden throwing spears survived in waterlogged ground for around 300,000 years. Finely made, balanced. Weapons built by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and among the oldest such hunting weapons we have ever found in such complete condition. And then this population, or these populations, split. One trajectory, the one in Africa, would lead, eventually, to us. Another, the one moving into the cold of Europe and Western Asia, would lead to the Neanderthals. And a third, pushing east, almost certainly fed into the Denisovans. From a single branching point, or a small cluster of them, at least 2 and probably 3 of the great human lineages of the late Ice Age were set in motion, each one walking off into a different climate, a different continent, a different future. This is the genealogical heart of the whole thing, and it is why nothing here is as simple as one species replacing another. We did not descend from the Neanderthals. They did not descend from us. We are not their improved model, and they were not our rough draft. We are siblings. We came from the same place, walked out different doors, were shaped by different worlds for hundreds of thousands of years, and then, much later, found each other again. The significance of Heidelbergensis is not really in its own story, which is fragmentary and contested and probably always will be. The significance is in what it represents. It is the fork in the blood, the moment the family became plural. Everyone you're about to meet, the people of the cold, the ghost from the well, the small humans of the island, the strangers in the deep cave, every one of them traces back, through different doors, to this branching. Hold the shape of it. Not a ladder, not even a single tree, but a delta. A river of ancestry splitting into channels, running separately across a vast plain of time, and then, against all the odds, some of those channels flowing back together at the end. We will follow the coldest channel first. We have done them a profound disservice, and we did it for about a century. The word Neanderthal entered the language as an insult. Brutish, stupid, stooped. The slur for the man at the back of the bar. That image came from a single early reconstruction, built from the skeleton of an old Neanderthal man whose spine was warped by arthritis. Scientists straightened a sick individual into a shambling caricature, and the caricature stuck for generations. It is one of the most consequential mistakes in the history of how a species understood its own relatives, because the real Neanderthals were nothing like the cartoon, and the truth is far more uncomfortable than the lie. They emerged in Europe and Western Asia somewhere around 400,000 years ago. Sit with that for a second, because the arithmetic is the whole point. By the time the first modern humans pushed into Europe, around 45,000 years ago, the Neanderthals had already been there for something on the order of 350,000 years. We were the newcomers. We were the immigrants arriving in a land that had been someone else's home for longer than our entire species had existed. They did not move into our world. We moved into theirs, and the world they had mastered was savage. They lived through the Ice Ages, and not the gentle phrase Ice Age we use casually over coffee, but the real thing, advancing glaciers, tundra, winters that would kill an unprepared modern human in hours. They did not just survive that, they were built for it. Their bodies were short, broad, deep-chested, dense with muscle, the body plan you see in cold-adapted animals everywhere, because a compact body holds heat. Their noses were large and complex, and a large nose in a freezing climate is not an accident. It warms and moistens brutal air before it reaches the lungs. Every line of their anatomy is a sentence about cold, written by the cold, over hundreds of thousands of years, and their brains were, on average, every bit as large as ours, possibly on average, a little larger. Let that finish off the cartoon properly. This was not a dim, lurching brute. This was a large-brained human, superbly engineered for one of the harshest environments any human has ever endured, holding down the European continent comfortably while our ancestors were still confined to Africa. What did they do with those brains? More than the slur ever allowed, They hunted the megafauna of the Ice Age: mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, bison, cave bear. These are not animals you ambush by accident. Bringing one down required planning, coordination, courage that is hard to overstate, and a willingness to get within arm's reach of something that could fold a person in half. The injuries on Neanderthal skeletons read famously like the injuries on rodeo riders. The damage of close, violent contact with very large animals. They were not scavenging the leftovers, they were the predators. And there is a tenderness in the record that the brute story has no place for. At multiple Neanderthal sites, scientists have found individuals who survived injuries and disabilities that would have made them helpless for long stretches. One man lived for years with a withered arm, blind in one eye, with old healed fractures. He could not have fed or defended himself alone. He lived anyway. Which means someone fed him. Someone kept him. For years. You can argue about what that means, and people do, but you cannot make it mean nothing. Somewhere in deep Ice Age Europe, in a population we called brutes, the weak were not always left to die. They were carried. I've stood in front of a cast of that man's skeleton, and the thing that gets you is not the damage. It is the years. Years is a long time to feed someone who cannot feed you back, in a world with no margin. That is not survival behaviour. That is a decision, made over and over by people we were taught had no inner life. They buried at least some of their dead, and the debate over how ritualised this was is real and ongoing, and we will get to a place where that exact debate becomes the whole story. They used pigments. They collected curious objects. There are sites where they appear to have arranged things for reasons that were not about eating or staying warm. Reasons that look, from a distance of 40,000 years, like meaning. And here is the discovery that has tightened in just the last 2 years, the one that should retire the old story for good. In 2025, researchers published the first major findings from a cave in central Israel called Tin Shemet, a site so painstaking to excavate that the sediment had set like concrete. In that cave, dating to roughly 100,000 years ago, they found burials, deliberate ones, and the tools, the use of red ochre, the very way the bodies were laid out, matched what is found at nearby sites occupied by modern humans. The same customs, the same symbolic behaviour, 2 different kinds of human in the same region, doing the same profound things with their dead. The simplest reading is that these were not parallel inventions in isolation, but a shared way of life that crossed the line between them. We will return to what that means. For now, just hear it clearly. The gap between them and us, the gap the old slur depended on, keeps closing. Every year, every dig. So the Neanderthals were not a failed prototype of humanity. They were a parallel humanity, a complete, competent, emotionally complex, physically formidable kind of human who owned the coldest theatre on Earth for the better part of 400,000 years, and who would have looked at our soft, narrow, tropical bodies arriving in their winter and reasonably wondered how we expected to last a season. And then, around 40,000 years ago, they were gone. At least gone in the way we usually mean it. No more distinctly Neanderthal people walking the Earth. The cold's own humans, the ones who had outlasted glaciers, fading out just as the newcomers spread. Except that is not what happened. Not entirely. The next chapter is the reason the word gone cannot survive contact with the evidence, because the Neanderthals did not only leave bones in caves, they left themselves in us. This is the part where the story stops being about the deep past and reaches up through 40,000 years to touch the person watching this. If your ancestry traces to anywhere outside Africa, you are, to a small but real degree, Neanderthal, not metaphorically, genetically. The figure most often cited, drawing on published genome-wide estimates, is somewhere between 1 and 2% of the genome for people of non-African descent, and people of East Asian ancestry, on average, carry somewhat more than people of European ancestry. Roughly 1 part in 50 or so of the instruction, set that built your body, was written by a different kind of human, in an ice age, before our species had a single permanent settlement anywhere on Earth. For a long time it was tempting to wave that away as junk, leftover noise from an ancient encounter, inert, meaningless, just sitting there. The last few years have demolished that idea completely. In 2023, a team anchored at Cornell University published a study in the journal eLife that did something the field had not been able to do cleanly before. They used a vast genetic database, the UK Biobank, with detailed genetic and trait data on nearly 300,000 people of non-African ancestry, and they built new statistical tools designed specifically to separate true Neanderthal-derived variants from the modern human DNA tangled around them. They examined more than 235,000 variants likely inherited from Neanderthals, and they found that over 4,300 of them are not inert at all. They are actively shaping 47 distinct traits in living people right now. Measurable things in the realm of immune response, of metabolism, of how the body develops, of how fast a person burns energy. It is not a small claim. 4,300 genetic switches, flipped by a species that has been bone and silence for 40,000 years, still helping to set the dials in human bodies that have never heard their name. It gets more specific and more pointed. Look at the immune system, the part of you that decides which microscopic invaders you can survive. There is a cluster of genes, known by the labels TLR1, TLR6 and TLR10, that act as early warning sensors for bacteria, fungi and parasites. In modern non-African populations, that whole cluster carries an unusually heavy load of archaic ancestry, far more than the genome-wide average, with most of the introgressed variants tracing to Neanderthals and a smaller share to Denisovans. The likely reason is a kind of grim, beautiful logic. When our ancestors left Africa, they walked into a world of pathogens they had never met and had no defences against. The Neanderthals had been living in that world, with those pathogens, for hundreds of thousands of years. Their immune systems had already paid for that knowledge in blood, and when the two populations mixed, that hard-won immune knowledge transferred, like inheriting a map of a minefield from someone who had crossed it the hard way. Interbreeding with Neanderthals may be one of the reasons our ancestors did not simply die of the local diseases the moment they arrived. And then there is the part of this story that nobody saw coming, the part that turned an ancient extinction into a headline in the 21st century. In 2020, as the world was shutting down, researchers were racing to understand why COVID-19 was so wildly uneven, why it barely touched some people and killed others. One thread of that research led somewhere astonishing. A stretch of DNA on chromosome 3 carried by roughly 16% of people of European descent and around half of people of South Asian descent was associated with a significantly higher risk of severe COVID-19. Where did that stretch come from? It was Neanderthal. A genetic legacy from an Ice Age cousin was, in 2020, helping to determine who ended up on a ventilator. The story did not stop there, and it did not stay one-directional. A follow-up line of work pointed to a different stretch of Neanderthal-derived DNA, this one on chromosome 12, carried by a large fraction of people across Eurasia and the Americas, that appeared to do the opposite. It was associated with a meaningfully reduced chance of needing intensive care after infection, on the order of around a fifth less risk. The same vanished species, through different fragments of inheritance, was both raising and lowering the odds of survival in a pandemic that struck a world they could never have imagined. A world of cities and aircraft and hospitals, 40,000 years after the last of them drew breath. A creature that has been extinct since before the invention of agriculture reached forward across all of that time and helped decide who lived through 2020. This is the moment the word extinct breaks in your hands. We say a species went extinct, and we picture a clean ending. The last one dies, the door closes, the line is over. But that is not what happened to the Neanderthals, and the genetics are not subtle about it. They did not simply die out. A version of what they were dissolved into the population that was expanding around them and kept going. The bodies ended. The information did not. It was absorbed, carried forward, copied into cell after cell after cell, down through more than 1,000 generations, into the immune systems and the metabolisms of people alive today who will never see a Neanderthal skull and never need to. There is a hard scientific caveat worth stating plainly, because honesty is the spine of this whole thing. The Cornell work also found that on the long view, modern human variants are gradually winning out over the Neanderthal ones across generations. The Neanderthal signal is slowly being filtered, edited down, outcompeted. So this is not a tidy fairy tale where they live on forever, untouched. It is something stranger and more true. They are being slowly erased, and they are still here, both at once, right now, in you, if your line ran through Europe or Asia. 40,000 years on, the erasing still is not finished. We will come back to what that does to the very idea of us. But first there is another ghost to meet, and this one we knew was real for 15 years before we ever saw its face. Most species in this story were found the normal way. Someone digs, a skull comes out of the ground, and you stand there holding the thing and looking at its face. The Denisovans were not found that way. The Denisovans were found the way you discover that a stranger has been living in your house, not by seeing them, but by finding their fingerprints on everything. It begins, almost absurdly, with a single fragment of a child's finger bone. In 2008, archaeologists were excavating a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, a place called Denisova Cave, named long ago after a hermit who supposedly lived there. Among the material they recovered was a tiny piece of a pinky bone, the kind of unremarkable scrap that fieldwork produces by the bucket. It was so small and so plain that nobody looking at it expected anything dramatic. It was sent off for genetic analysis essentially as routine, the working assumption being that it would turn out to be Neanderthal, since Neanderthals were known to have used that cave. In 2010, the result came back, and it did not match anything. It was not Neanderthal, it was not modern human. The genome inside that sliver of child's finger belonged to a kind of human that science had no name for, no skeleton of, no prior knowledge of whatsoever. An entire branch of humanity, completely unknown, announced to the world by a fingertip and a sequence of code. They named them Denisovans, after the cave, because the cave was very nearly all they had. Think about how strange that is as a way to meet a species. We did not find the Denisovans and then learn their genetics. We learnt their genetics and then went looking for the rest of them, mostly in vain. For years, the entire physical record of this kind of human could fit in a cupped hand. That finger bone, a few large molars, a fragment of skull. From that almost nothing, two facts emerged that turned out to be enormous. First, the Denisovans were a distinct lineage, the sister branch to the Neanderthals. The two of them split from each other deep in the past, both of them splitting earlier still from our own line, all three streams running back to that delta we talked about. Second, and this is the one that changes everything, the Denisovans had not stayed in their cave. Their DNA was scattered across living people in Asia, in the islands of Southeast Asia, and out into the Pacific. Based on the spread of that genetic signature, they appear to have ranged across an immense sweep of the continent, possibly a larger range than any other archaic human, and they had done what the Neanderthals did. They had mixed with us. We will get to the most spectacular thing the Denisovans gave us in the chapter after next, because it deserves its own air. For now, hold on to the eeriness of how this went. There was a kind of human whose existence we did not even suspect, and pieces of them were inside living people the entire time we did not know. We were carrying them before we could name them. The gift arrived before we had any idea there had been a giver. For 15 years that was the haunting shape of the Denisovans, a genome with no face, a population defined by absence. We knew their code, we knew roughly where they had been, we knew they were woven into us, and we had no idea what they looked like. Every museum reconstruction was a guess. Every artist's rendering was a sophisticated shrug. The most consequential ghost in human prehistory, and we could not picture them. That is what makes the next chapter one of the genuinely thrilling moments in this entire field. A moment that happened not in some distant decade, but in the last year, while most people were not looking. Because in 2025 the ghost got a face, and the face had been sitting at the bottom of a well in China the whole time. Come back to the well. We opened with the labourer in 1933 and the skull he hid in the dark for 85 years. Now we can finish what that opening started, because the rest of that story is one of the most important things to happen in the study of human origins in a generation, and almost all of it happened recently enough that older documentaries on this subject simply do not contain it. When the Harbin skull came back into scientific hands after 2018, it was immediately obvious that it was something extraordinary. It is nearly complete. A real skull, not a sliver, which in this field is like being handed a photograph after years of working from a single fingerprint. It is massive. It has a huge cranial vault, capable of holding a brain comparable in size to ours or a Neanderthal's. It has a long, low, wide face, a heavy shelf of brow, and a strange combination of the ancient and the modern, stitched together in one head. It is at least 146,000 years old. In 2021, a team led by researchers in China formally described it as a new species and gave it that mythological name, Homo longi, Dragon Man, after the Dragon River region where it had been found. The naming caused immediate controversy, because this field always does, and because a single spectacular skull with no genetic data is exactly the kind of thing scientists fight about for decades. And then a paleogeneticist named Xiaomei Fu got involved, and she was precisely the right person, because back in 2010 she'd been part of the original team that pulled the Denisovan genome out of that finger bone in the first place. She and her colleagues set out to do something that sounds like it should not be possible. Extract genetic information from a skull that old, found in those conditions, with that history. The dense bone of the skull and the petrous bone yielded almost no usable ancient DNA, only a set of ancient proteins. So they tried something more audacious. They turned to the teeth, specifically to dental calculus, the hardened fossilized plaque cemented onto the teeth in life. Inside that ancient grime they found trapped genetic material, mitochondrial DNA, that the bone itself had not preserved. And in 2 papers published in June 2025 in Cell and in Science, they reported the result. The Harbin skull, Dragon Man, was a Denisovan. The ghost had a face. After 15 years of knowing the Denisovans only as a code without a body, here was a near-complete head you could hold and photograph and look in the eye sockets of. One of the researchers put it simply. After 15 years, they could finally give the Denisovan a face. It is hard to convey, if you do not work in this field, how big that is. It is the difference between knowing someone exists from their handwriting and finally seeing a photograph of them, and the consequences ripple outward immediately, which is the part that genuinely rewrites the map. For decades, Eastern Asia has been littered with strange skulls and fragments that nobody could confidently classify. Too big to be one thing, too odd to be another, shoved into a vague drawer labelled archaic. Now there is a key. If the distinctively shaped Harbin skull is a Denisovan, then a whole population of mysterious large-skulled fossils across China and beyond suddenly has somewhere to belong. We may have been looking at Denisovans for a century without knowing it, misfiled, unrecognised, hiding in plain sight in museum collections, exactly the way the most important skull of all was hiding at the bottom of a well. This is what this story keeps doing, and the pattern is the point, so it is worth saying out loud. We did not find these other humans laid out neatly for us. We found a Neanderthal inside a slur and had to dig the real one back out from under it. We found a Denisovan inside a finger bone and a smear of fossil plaque. We're still, right now, in this decade, realising that some of them have been sitting in our own drawers, mislabelled the entire time. The lost humans were never as lost as the textbooks implied. Mostly, we just had not learned how to recognise them yet. Which raises a question we have been quietly skating past for 7 chapters, and it is time to face it. How do we know any of this? A skull at the bottom of a well is one thing, but genomes pulled from a fingertip, immune genes traced to a vanished cousin, a species name from the plaque on a tooth. How is any of that even possible? The answer is its own story, and it is one of the great detective stories in the history of science. None of what comes next exists without it. For most of human history, we had no idea any of this was true. We thought we were it. We thought we always had been. The first crack in that certainty came in 1856, in a limestone quarry in a valley in Germany called the Neanderthal Valley. Workers blasting for stone cleared out a small cave and threw the rubble down the slope. In the debris were some oddly thick bones, a piece of a skull with a heavy sloping brow, some limb bones built like a weightlifter's. A local teacher recognised they were not from a bear and not, quite, from a normal person. They were handed to anatomists, and the anatomists fell into an argument that, in a sense, has never fully ended. Some said it was a modern human, just diseased, a sick man, perhaps a sufferer of rickets, perhaps an old soldier whose pained brow had set into a permanent frown. Others said no. This was something else, an earlier kind of human, a separate creature. Remember that this was before Darwin published On the Origin of Species. There was, at that moment, no scientific framework in which an earlier kind of human was even a sensible sentence. The bones from the Neanderthal Valley were arguably the first physical evidence ever found that humanity had not always stood alone, and the world had no language to hear it. It took decades, and more skeletons, and an entire revolution in biology before the truth settled. This was a different human. We named it after the valley, Neanderthal, the Valley of Neander. The knowledge that we were ever not alone is barely a century and a half old. For all but the last sliver of our existence, our species did not even know its own family had been crowded. We discovered our lost relatives roughly the same decade we were laying the first transatlantic telegraph cable. On the timescale of this story, we found out yesterday. And for the next 100-odd years, everything we learned from shape, from bones and stones. You measured a skull, you compared a jaw, you argued about a brow ridge. It was painstaking, it was brilliant, and it had a hard ceiling. Shape can tell you what a creature looked like. It is far weaker at telling you who they loved, who they mixed with, what flowed between them and us. For that, you would need to read the actual instructions, the genetic code itself, out of bones tens of thousands of years old, and for most of the 20th century, every serious scientist knew that was impossible. DNA is fragile. It shatters and degrades after death. The idea of recovering a readable genome from an Ice Age fossil was frankly science fiction. One man spent his career refusing to accept that. His name is Svante Pääbo, and the field he essentially willed into existence is called paleogenetics. The early going was almost comically hard. Ancient DNA does not come out of a bone in a clean ribbon. It comes out shattered into countless tiny fragments, chemically damaged, and worst of all, drowned in contamination. Every fossil is smeared with the DNA of the bacteria that fed on it, the scientists who handled it, the modern world it has sat in. Trying to read an ancient human genome was like trying to reconstruct one specific book after it had been torn into confetti, soaked, half-rotted, and then mixed into a landfill of other shredded books. For years it did not work. Or it worked, and the result turned out to be contamination, which is its own kind of heartbreak. But the tools sharpened. The methods to screen out contamination got ruthless. The sequencing technology to read billions of tiny fragments and computationally reassemble them arrived. And piece by impossible piece, Pääbo and the field he built did the thing everyone had said could not be done. In 2010, the same year, not by coincidence, that the Denisovan fingerbone gave up its secret, his team published a first draft of the Neanderthal genome, the instructions of a vanished human, read off bones 40,000 years old, and reading it produced the single most consequential sentence in this entire story. When they compared the Neanderthal genome to living people, the Neanderthal DNA was not confined to the past, it was in us. Present-day people carried it. That one finding detonated the old story of clean replacement and rebuilt it as the story of mixture you have been hearing all night. In 2022, Svante Pääbo was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for it, a prize in effect for discovering that the boundary between us and the others was never a wall. Understand what that machinery means for everything in this video because it is the quiet engine under all of it. The 47 traits shaped by Neanderthal genes, read with these tools, the Denisovans, a species first known from no skull at all, only a genome, found with these tools. The altitude gene traced from Tibetans back to a vanished people, proven with these tools. Dragon Man unmasked from the plaque on its teeth. The precise dating of the 7,000-year entanglement. The very claim that extinct is the wrong word. All of it, every piece, rests on the ability to read genetic code out of the dead. We are not finding these humans by digging more holes, mostly. We are finding them by learning, finally, how to listen to the ones we already had. And that is exactly why the map keeps changing under our feet, and why a documentary made even a few years ago is already out of date. The bones are mostly the same bones. What is changing, fast, is our ability to make them talk. Which is how we can now say, with hard evidence rather than a hopeful guess, what one of these vanished peoples was doing in the single most hostile place any human has ever called home. Take a lowland human, someone whose ancestors live near sea level, and put them on the Tibetan plateau, more than 3,000 meters up, and their body begins to fight itself. The air is thin, there is not enough oxygen, so the body does the obvious thing. It makes more red blood cells to carry what oxygen there is. And the obvious thing is the dangerous thing. The blood thickens, it sludges. Over time it strains the heart, damages the pregnancy, sets the stage for chronic mountain sickness. The lowlanders' own emergency response slowly poisons them. For most of humanity, the plateau is a place the body cannot stay. Tibetans do not have this problem. People who have lived on the high plateau for generations do not mount that dangerous red blood cell surge. They function, work, thrive, carry healthy pregnancies at altitudes that would, over time, break most of the rest of our species. This is one of the cleanest examples of recent dramatic human adaptation that we have, and for years the obvious question was the simplest one. How? How did one population of humans evolve, apparently very quickly, the ability to live where the air itself is hostile? The answer is a gene called EPAS1, which helps govern the body's response to low oxygen. The Tibetan version of it is what keeps the blood from thickening fatally at altitude. And in 2014, a study in Nature traced where that specific version came from. It did not arise gradually in Tibetans through ordinary mutation and selection. It was inherited more or less whole from somewhere else. The Tibetan high-altitude variant of EPAS1 is found in Denisovans and almost nowhere else on Earth. Somewhere, at some point in the deep past, the ancestors of modern Tibetans encountered Denisovans. They mixed. And in that mixing, a gene crossed over, a gene the Denisovans almost certainly carried because their populations had lived high and hard for a very long time, and that single inherited stretch of code is the reason a whole people can live on the roof of the world today. The Denisovans handed the Tibetans the key to a place no one else could hold. A vanished species is the reason a living one can breathe where you and I would slowly drown in our own blood. For a long time that was an inference, a gene with a strange origin, implying a meeting we could not see. The last 2 years made the meeting concrete, and they made it brutal. In 2024, a study published in Nature reported on a cave called Bashir Karst Cave, sitting on the northeastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, more than 3,000 meters above sea level. Years earlier, a jawbone from that cave had been identified as Denisovan, pushing them onto the plateau around 160,000 years ago. But the new work went further. The team analysed more than 2,500 bone fragments from the cave, using a technique that reads the chemical signature of collagen to identify which animal, or which human, a shattered scrap of bone came from. And what they reconstructed was not a single ghostly presence. It was a way of life. The bones told them what the Denisovans of this cave were eating and how. Blue sheep, wild yak, wild horses, marmots, birds, the extinct woolly rhinoceros, spotted hyena, and the bones carried the marks, cut marks, butchery traces, the signature of a creature that hunted these animals, processed them, broke them open for marrow, and even shaped some of the bone into tools. This was not a population clinging to survival by its fingernails at the edge of livable space. This was a population that had made one of the most extreme environments on the planet into a home, and held it through cold periods, through a warmer interglacial, through the deep grind of the Ice Age, for something on the order of 160,000 years. And there is one fragment that reframes everything around it. The team identified a rib bone from a layer dated to between roughly 48,000 and 32,000 years ago. That makes it one of the youngest Denisovan fossils ever found. Run the timeline forward, and the implication is stark. There were Denisovans alive, hunting on that frozen plateau, at the very time modern humans were spreading across Eurasia, painting the walls of caves in Europe, making the art we put in museums and call the dawn of the human mind. While we were doing that, they were still up there, still surviving where we could not have. Not a relic of an earlier age, but a contemporary, holding the highest, hardest ground on Earth, while our part of the family told itself it was the only one that mattered. There is a line worth saying slowly here, because it is the truest sentence about the Denisovans anyone has written. We did not find them first in a city, or a tomb, or a temple. We found them inside us. We were carrying their gift for breathing thin air long before we had the faintest idea they had ever existed. The giver was invisible. The gift was in our blood the whole time. That is 2 of the great vanished humans accounted for. The people of the cold and the ghost of the high country. The next breaks a different rule entirely. What happens to a human being when you take an entire species and lock it on an island for 500,000 years? In 2003, on the Indonesian island of Flores, in a deep cave called Liangbua, archaeologists dug up a skeleton, and the skeleton broke the rules. She was an adult woman. She had reached full growth, lived an adult life, and died, and she stood roughly 1 meter tall. About the height of a modern child of 5 or 6. That alone is startling, but it is not the part that stunned the world. The part that stunned the world was her skull. Her brain volume was around 417 cubic centimeters. That is roughly a third of a typical modern human brain. It is in the range of a chimpanzee, and around her in the same deposits was the evidence of what she and her people had done. Stone tools, the traces of fire, the bones of a dwarf form of an extinct elephant relative, a pygmy elephant, that they had hunted on the island. A human being the size of a small child, with a brain the size of an ape's, was making tools using fire and bringing down elephants. The instinct, immediately and for years afterward, was to explain her away. She must be a modern human with a disease, some pathology of growth that shrank the skull. She must be a deformed individual, a one-off, an error. The scientific fight over this was ferocious and went on for a long time, because what the alternative implied was so hard to absorb. But the alternative kept winning. She was not sick. She was not a child. She was not a lone freak. She was a fully formed, ordinary adult of a separate kind of human, a species in her own right. Science called her Homo floresiensis. The world, instantly and forever, called her the Hobbit. So how do you get a human like that? How does our family produce a competent, fire-using, elephant-hunting people the size of a kindergartner with the brain of a chimp? The leading answer is one of the strangest reliable processes in biology, and the island itself is the engine. It is called island dwarfism, and it is well documented across the animal world. Strand a population of large animals on an island. Limited food, limited space, often no big predators, and over enough generations, evolution shrinks them. A smaller body needs less energy to run. In a closed world with a hard ceiling on resources, small is not a defect. Small is the winning move. Flores proves the rule with more than one species. The same island that shrank these humans also shrank elephants down to pygmy size, in exactly the same way, for exactly the same reason. And the last 2 years pushed the story deeper and older and, frankly, stranger. About 75 kilometres from the cave is an open-air site called Mata Mengi, and the layers there are not 60,000 years old. They are around 700,000 years old. Earlier work had already pulled a jaw fragment and some teeth from those ancient layers, small, hinting that the shrinking had begun far back in time. Then, in 2024, came a piece of an adult upper arm bone. It is the smallest adult arm bone of any human ever found, anywhere, in the entire fossil record. The body, it implies, was around a metre tall, and crucially, slightly smaller than the already tiny hobbit from 60,000 years ago. 700,000 years before that famous skeleton, the people of Flores were, if anything, even tinier. The picture consensus has moved toward by now is this. A population of Homo erectus, that great 2 million year traveller from our second chapter, reached the island possibly 1 million years ago or more. It arrived already a little smaller than its mainland relatives, and then the island went to work on it. Over hundreds of thousands of years in isolation, it shrank and kept its tools and its fire and its hunting the entire way down, until it had become something that barely resembled its own ancestors, a separate human species manufactured by an island. And the disappearance fits the same theme as everything else in this story. Quiet, environmental, no thunderclap. A 2025 study in the journal Communications Earth and Environment pointed to a prolonged drying trend in the region around Liangbua, with severe drought intensifying around 61,000 years ago and continuing into the window when Homo floresiensis vanishes from the cave record. Less fresh water, fewer of the pygmy elephants they depended on. Not a war, not a massacre, a landscape slowly tightening around them until it could no longer hold them. But the question the Hobbit leaves behind is the one that should keep you up. We are deeply attached to the idea that the human mind requires a big human brain, that intelligence is something you buy with cubic centimetres. Homo floresiensis had a brain a third the size of yours and used fire, made tools to a plan, and cooperatively hunted dangerous animals for hundreds of thousands of years on an island that would have killed an unprepared modern human. Their brain was not just a shrunken copy of ours. Based on what we know from endocasts of the skull, it was reorganised. A different architecture, doing competent human things with a fraction of the hardware we assumed was mandatory. The island did not just make them small, it made them a standing argument against one of our most comfortable assumptions about ourselves. And remarkably, Flores was not even the only island running this experiment. Far to the north, on another island, something similar was happening to another kind of human entirely. This one barely made the news, and that is part of why it matters. It tells you how much of this story is still missing. On the island of Luzon in the Philippines, in a place called Calao Cave, researchers recovered a small set of remains. A handful of teeth, some bones of the hand and foot. Not a skeleton, not a skull, a scatter. From that scatter in 2019, they described another new human species, Homo luzonensis. The fossils date to somewhere in the range of 50 to 67,000 years ago, which means this was yet another kind of human alive in the same broad window as everyone else in this story. What is striking about Homo luzonensis is the same thing that is striking about the Hobbit, arrived at independently on a completely different island, separated by open ocean and roughly 3,000 kilometres. The remains are small, and they are a mosaic. Teeth that look surprisingly modern in some ways, sitting alongside finger and toe bones that are curved, the kind of curvature you associate with much older, more tree-adapted ancestors. A creature stitched together from different epochs, marooned on an island, small. We know almost nothing else about them. We do not know what their faces looked like. We do not know exactly where they came from or precisely when they ended. The entire species, as far as the physical record goes, is a few teeth and a few small bones in a cave on one island. And that is the point worth pausing on. Because if a whole kind of human can hide for tens of thousands of years inside a fragment that small, on one island, in a record this thin, how many others are there that we simply have not found? Homo luzonensis is not really a chapter about Homo luzonensis. It is a chapter about the size of our ignorance. 2 separate islands, 2 independent experiments, 2 new kinds of human, both discovered in the last couple of decades, one of them from almost nothing. The human family was not 8 or 9 tidy species standing in a row. It was a riot of local experiments, most of them never written down, and most of them almost certainly still in the ground. But before we leave these islands, there is a question we have been quietly stepping over, and it is one of the strangest in the entire human story. We keep saying these species reach the islands. We say it lightly, the way you would say someone reached the next town. Stop and look at what the word is hiding. Flores is not connected to anything. Neither is Luzon. To stand on them, something had to get across open, deep, moving ocean, and the things that got across were not us. There is a line drawn through Indonesia that you cannot see and cannot cross by accident, and almost nothing in the natural world is allowed past it. In the 1800s, the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, the man who arrived at natural selection at the same time as Darwin, noticed something uncanny as he travelled through the islands of Southeast Asia. On one side of a narrow strait the animals were Asian, the monkeys, the big cats, the elephants, the whole familiar cast. Cross that strait, sometimes a gap of only a few dozen kilometres, and the entire animal world changed. The Asian animals were simply gone, replaced by marsupials and cockatoos and creatures with no mainland relatives at all. The boundary was so sharp it was as if a wall stood in the water. We call it the Wallace Line, and the islands east of it, Sulawesi, Flores, Timor, and the rest we call Wallacea. The reason the wall exists is the seafloor. The straits along that line are deep. Even at the coldest peak of the ice ages, when so much of the planet's water was locked into glaciers that sea levels dropped and land bridges rose all over the world, these channels never closed. The water there has been water the entire time humans have existed, and it runs fast with powerful currents. For a land animal that cannot fly, the gap was, in practical terms, sealed. That is why the elephants stopped. That is why the tigers stopped. The Wallace Line is one of the most effective barriers to life on the surface of the Earth, and for millions of years it held almost everything back. It did not hold our relatives back. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Modern humans, us, Homo sapiens, did not cross that water until somewhere in the last 100,000 years, on the Long Island hopping road that would eventually carry people to Australia. We think of ocean crossing as one of our species' signature feats, a late and brilliant trick, but the stone tools say someone else was there first and not by a little. On Flores, flaked tools sit in layers more than 1 million years old. On Luzon, far to the north, there are stone tools and the cut-marked bones of a butchered rhinoceros from around 700,000 years ago. Somebody stood on that island that long ago and took apart a large animal with sharpened stone, and then, announced in 2025, the oldest evidence of all, on the island of Sulawesi, at a site called Kallio, stone tools dated to at least 1,040,000 years old. The single earliest trace anywhere on Earth of a member of our family standing on the far side of deep water. No bones came with those tools. We do not know for certain who made them. The best candidate everywhere in this region is Homo erectus, the 2 million-year traveller from early in this story, or some isolated offshoot of that lineage, already drifting toward the strangeness that would become the island dwarfs. But the identity, in a sense, is the smaller mystery. The larger mystery is the one word we keep using and keep not explaining. How? The honest scientific answer is humbling, and it is almost the opposite of the heroic version you might want. The leading view, argued forcefully by the archaeologists who found the oldest of these tools, is that there were no boats. There is no evidence these early hominins could build a watercraft or navigate one, and the strait was far too wide to swim and the currents far too strong to fight. What probably happened is an accident, a storm, or more likely a tsunami, and that coastline is one of the most violently seismic places on the planet, tearing loose great rafts of matted vegetation, whole tangled islands of trees and roots and soil, and sweeping them out to sea with animals clinging to them. Rodents are thought to have crossed that way. Monkeys are thought to have crossed that way. And at least a few times, across hundreds of thousands of years, the cargo on one of those floating mats may have included a few terrified members of the human family, carried out past the Wallace line against every intention, and deposited alive on a shore no hominin had ever touched. Sit with what that means. Under this reading of the evidence, the founding population of an entire human species, the ancestors of the Hobbit, and very likely of the Luzon people too, may have been a handful of individuals who did not choose to go anywhere. They were victims of a wave. Their colonization of a new world was a shipwreck without a ship, and on the far side, cut off, with no way back, evolution took the survivors and rebuilt them. The crossing was an accident. The species was the consequence. It happened more than once, and it kept happening. On Sulawesi, the human presence is not a single freak event a million years ago. Later tools at other sites there show hominins still on the island a couple of 100,000 years ago, deep into the age of Neanderthals and Denisovans. Wallacea was not a place someone reached once. It was a place the human family kept washing up on. Generation after improbable generation, each arrival sealed off from the last. And it matters far beyond these few islands, because this drowned, scattered, accidental world is almost certainly where some of the threads from earlier in this story finally touch. The genetic evidence points to this region as one of the places where modern humans, sweeping through tens of thousands of years later, met and mixed with the older lineages already in Asia. The water that marooned the first arrivals became much later the room where the bloodlines met. So here is the reframing this chapter leaves you with. We like to imagine that the great barriers in human prehistory were the dramatic ones, the ice sheets, the deserts, the mountain walls. But the barrier that shaped some of the strangest humans who ever lived was none of those. It was moving water, a few dozen kilometres of it, and our family did not conquer it. Our family fell into it, by accident, and a few of us happened to float. Survival, again and again in this story, turns out to look less like triumph and more like luck that nobody planned and nobody understood. The water held almost everything back, and let a few of us through by chance. The next barrier in this story is the exact opposite. It let nothing through at all, and what is on the far side of it was not carried there by an accident of the sea. It was carried there, in the dark, straight down into the rock, by something with hands. In 2013, 2 recreational cavers were threading the Rising Star cave system in South Africa when they pushed through a vertical crack in the rock, a chute so tight, in places only about 18 centimetres across, that only the slimmest adult human can pass through it at all. On the far side, in a chamber in total darkness, the beam of their light fell on the floor. The floor was full of bones, not a few. Eventually the remains of at least 15 individuals, and the number has grown with further work. Adults, adolescents, children, infants. All of them the same kind of creature, and the creature was new to science. They named it Homo naledi. Naledi means star in the Sesotho language, after the Rising Star system and the chamber where it began. Homo naledi is one of the most disorienting humans ever found, because it refuses to sit anywhere on the old ladder. The brain was tiny, roughly a third the size of a modern human's, in the same general territory as the Hobbit, as an Australopithecine, as something that should be deeply ancient. The hands were strongly curved, the fingers built for powerful grasping and climbing, an old and primitive signature. And then you look at the feet, and the feet are almost indistinguishable from yours. The legs are long and built for striding, This is a creature with an ape-like brain, and a climber's hands and a modern human's walk, all in one body, a combination nobody expected to find in a single individual, let alone a whole chamber full of them. And then came the part that detonated, the dating. Homo naledi was not, as the primitive features first suggested, 2 million years old. The deposits date to somewhere in the range of 230,000 to 335,000 years ago, which means this small-brained, deep-cave human was alive at essentially the same time the very first members of our own species were appearing on the same continent. A creature with a brain a third of ours was not an ancient ancestor watching from the distant past. It was a contemporary, a neighbour. But the real fight, the one that has not stopped, the one that gets sharper every year, is about how the bones got into that chamber at all. In 2023, a team led by the paleoanthropologist Lee Berger published an extraordinary claim. The bodies, they argued, did not wash in, did not fall in, were not dragged in by predators. They were deliberately put there. Homo naledi, they said, was carrying its dead through the pitch-black, lethally tight passages of that cave system and burying them, intentionally, repeatedly. And they reported what looked like deliberate engravings on the cave walls nearby. Crosshatches, geometric shapes, lines that appeared scratched and smoothed by intent. If true, this would mean a human with a third of our brain was performing mortuary behaviour and making symbolic marks earlier than any known burial by our species or by the Neanderthals, by something on the order of 100,000 years. The response from the field was immediate and harsh, and a model of how science is supposed to fight. Other researchers, led by scientists including Martin Torres and colleagues, published a direct challenge in the Journal of Human Evolution, arguing the evidence did not support deliberate burial or intentional art at all, that there were simpler explanations and the extraordinary claim had not cleared the extraordinary bar. A subsequent 2024 study by Feck and colleagues examining the cave floor sediments argued that the geological evidence for deliberately dug graves was not there. Berger's critics were not being dismissive for sport. They were holding the line that the most spectacular claims need the most bulletproof proof, and they did not think the proof was bulletproof. And here is the genuinely important update, the part that older treatments of this subject simply cannot contain, because it happened in 2025. Berger's team did not retreat. They came back with a far more extensive paper published in eLife, this time pulling in many more outside experts, co-authors spanning multiple institutions across multiple countries, exactly the kind of broad scrutiny critics had said was missing the first time. They presented their strongest case yet, skeletal material found in tight articulated arrangements, consistent with bodies that were covered by sediment before they could decay, no sign of disturbance by water or carnivores, no evidence the chamber was ever lived in. A space, they argued, that was used for one purpose, and that purpose was the dead. The argument is not over. It is, if anything, more alive than ever. There is now a genuine spectrum of expert opinion, from this is the earliest known mortuary behaviour in any human, to the bodies were certainly carried in there somehow, even if burial overstates it, to we still cannot rule out simpler explanations. All of these positions are being argued right now in peer-reviewed journals by serious people. That is not a weakness in the science. That is the science working in real time, in public, on a question that genuinely matters. Because strip away the technical fight and what remains is one of the largest questions a human being can ask. Does caring about the dead, doing something with a body that goes beyond necessity, that reaches toward meaning, require a large brain? Is that capacity something you can only afford with cubic centimetres of cortex, the way we have always quietly assumed? Or can it flicker into being in a mind built on a third of the hardware in the dark at the bottom of a cave? 250,000 years ago? We do not know. What is not in dispute is the part that should give you chills regardless of who wins the argument. The bones of Homo naledi are down there. Children and infants and adults of a small-brained human, deep inside a system that takes extraordinary, dangerous effort for a person to enter, arranged in ways that demand an explanation. Something put them there. The fight is only about what kind of something, and whether the something was grief. The naledi argument forces a question, and the question does not stay politely confined to one small-brained species in one South African cave. It spreads. Because if we are willing to fight this hard over whether a third of a size brain could reach toward meaning, What about the large-brained ones? What were the Neanderthals, with brains the equal of ours, actually doing in the dark? For a century the answer was nothing much. That answer is now demonstrably false. Go back to the cartoon we dismantled earlier. We took apart its anatomy then, but the deepest part of that lie was never about the body. It was about the mind. The real claim hidden inside the slur was this: they did not have an inner life. They survived, they ate, they bred, they died, and nothing in there ever reached for anything beyond the next meal. No symbols, no meaning, no spark. Two caves end that argument. Hold them in your mind side by side. The first is in southwest France, and it is called Bruniquel. In 1990, a teenage boy in a local caving club dug through rubble that had sealed the entrance for tens of thousands of years and squeezed into a passage no one had entered since the Ice Age. They went deep, and deep here is not a figure of speech. Around 336 metres from the entrance, far past any glimmer of daylight, in the total and permanent dark, their lights fell on something that should not have been there. Stalagmites, the stone spires that grow up from a cave floor over millennia, had been deliberately broken off, hundreds of them, snapped to roughly even lengths, and arranged into two large ring-shaped structures, the bigger one more than 5 metres across, with smaller stacked piles and clear traces of fire among them. Somebody built that. Somebody went 1/3 of a kilometre into a mountain in absolute darkness, carrying fire to see by, and constructed deliberate architecture out of broken stone for a purpose we cannot recover. And here is the part that breaks the brute forever. Those structures were dated, and the date came back at around 176,000 years old. There were no modern humans in Europe then. There would not be, for well over 100,000 more years. The only people on that entire continent capable of walking into Bruniquel Cave were Neanderthals. They are the builders. There is no one else it could be. Read what that requires of a mind. To go that deep, you need controlled fire and the means to carry and sustain it underground. You need to not be terrified of the deep dark or to master the terror. You need a reason, a plan formed before you entered, because nobody improvises architecture by torchlight in a place with no food and no shelter, and no obvious survival payoff at all. Whatever those rings were for, they were not for eating, and not for staying warm. They were for something else. Something that mattered enough to do in the worst possible place to do it. We do not know what it meant. We know it meant something. 176,000 years ago, in the dark under France, a human mind that was not ours wanted something that had nothing to do with survival and acted on it. The second cave, or really 3 caves in Spain, closes the other half of the argument. Not building, but marking. At sites called La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales, there are markings on the rock, a ladder-like red shape. Hand stencils made by placing a hand on the wall and blowing pigment around it, leaving a negative print, the most human gesture imaginable. I was here. This is my hand. Red ochre applied to the great stone draperies, deliberately brought in from elsewhere, splattered and blown onto the formations. For years, the cautious assumption was that this was modern human work, because surely it had to be. Then, in 2018, a team used a dating method that reads the age of the thin mineral crusts that slowly grow over cave paintings, and the results were a quiet earthquake. The markings were older than 64,000 years. In one cave, a hand stencil came back older than 66,000. That is, again, well before modern humans reached Europe by something like 20,000 years. The only possible artists, given the dates, were Neanderthals, and follow-up work showed the red ochre at Ardales was not applied once. It was applied again and again, across many thousands of years by generation after generation, returning to the same place to mark it the same way. That last detail is the one that should stay with you. This was not a single individual on a single strange afternoon. It was a tradition, something taught, a parent showing a child, that child growing old and showing another child. The practice carried down a chain of people across a span of time, longer than all of recorded human civilization, all of them returning to the same dark stone to do the same deliberate, useless, meaningful thing. That is not the behaviour of a brute. That is culture. That is a people with something inside them they felt compelled to express and to pass on, and to keep alive across the generations the way you keep a fire alive. Now hold all of it together. Bruniquel, architecture in the deep dark, 176,000 years ago. Spain, among the oldest known painted marks on Earth, a hand pressed to a wall and outlined in red, a tradition maintained for millennia. The care for the injured we saw in an earlier chapter, the man with the withered arm who was fed for years, the burials, the pigment, the shared funerary customs at Tinchamet, where two kinds of human apparently lived in a single shared cultural world. None of these is the isolated fluke the old story needed each of them to be. Together they describe a kind of human with a rich, durable, transmitted inner life, a human that built, marked, mourned, remembered and reached in the dark for something beyond the body. And this is what makes the naledi debate so much more than an academic squabble, and why the two caves had to come right after it. We are watching in real time the collapse of one of our most self-flattering beliefs, that the inner life, symbol, meaning, the impulse to mark and mourn and build for no practical reason, was our private invention, the thing that made us, specifically us, special. The Neanderthals had it with brains the size of ours. The argument over Homo naledi is, at bottom, the argument over whether it can run on a brain a third that size. The trend of the evidence, year after year, dig after dig, points relentlessly in one direction. The spark we thought was uniquely ours was burning in the others too, possibly long before us, possibly in minds built very differently from ours. We were not the inventors of meaning. On the evidence we now have, we may just be its last surviving practitioners, which makes the next discovery almost unbearably fitting. A kind of human argued into existence not from a famous dig, but from bones that sat misunderstood in a drawer for 50 years, in a part of the family tree so tangled that scientists gave its confusion its own name. There is a phrase paleoanthropologists use, half in frustration and half in surrender, for one particular slice of the human story. They call it the muddle in the middle. The middle is the long stretch roughly between 700,000 and 300,000 years ago, and the muddle is what happens when you try to sort the human fossils from that stretch into species. They will not behave. They are full of mixtures. This skull has a Neanderthalish brow, but a modernish back. That one has a huge brain case, but archaic features around it. For decades, when a fossil from East Asia would not fit neatly into Homo erectus or Neanderthal or modern human, it tended to get swept into a vague holding pen labelled archaic Homo sapiens, which is less a classification than an admission of defeat. The muddle was a place where inconvenient humans went to be ignored. In 2024, two researchers, Zhujie Wu in China and Christopher Bay, decided to stop ignoring it. They went back to fossils that had been excavated in the 1970s at a Chinese site called Shujiayao, where earlier digs had recovered more than 10,000 stone tools and around 21 fossil fragments from roughly 10 different individuals. These had been sitting, studied but unresolved for the better part of 50 years. Wu and Bay looked at them again, alongside other large-skulled remains from the region, and argued that they did not belong in anyone's existing box. They represented, the researchers proposed, a distinct population, and they gave it a new name, Homo juluensis. The name comes from Chinese words meaning, roughly, huge head, because that is the defining feature. These were people with enormous skulls. Estimates for their cranial capacity run very high, in some specimens up towards 17 or 1800 cubic centimetres, larger on average than ours. They appear to have lived across Eastern Asia somewhere in the window of roughly 300,000 to 50,000 years ago. Based on the associated stone tools and animal bones, the picture the researchers sketched is vivid. Large-brained people who hunted wild horses in coordinated groups, processed the animals completely, worked the hides to survive ferocious winters, living in small bands across a hard country. Now, two honest cautions because this story has tried to be honest the whole way through and is not going to stop here. First, Homo juluensis is a new and contested proposal, not a settled fact. Naming a species from fragmentary material is exactly the kind of move the rest of the field probes hard, and not everyone is convinced. Second, and far more interesting, the same researchers floated an idea that, if it holds, reshapes a large part of this entire video. They suggested that some of the fossils currently filed under Denisovan, including material from Tibet, might actually belong with their big-headed people. In other words, the mysterious skulls of Eastern Asia, the Denisovans, Dragon Man, the big-headed people, might be facets of one sprawling, variable, poorly understood Asian population that we have been carving up with different names because we found the pieces at different times and did not realise they were the same puzzle. Other researchers looking at the same fossils lean the opposite way. They argue that the Zoogion material may actually group with the Harbin and Dragonman skull under Homo longi, the Denisovans, rather than constitute a separate species. Whether or not any specific version of these proposals survives, and they may not, the deeper lesson is the one that should stay with you. Naming species is not the discovery of clean lines in nature. It is us, with our limited fragments and our human craving for tidy categories, trying to impose order on something that was not orderly. The reality on the ground, hundreds of thousands of years ago, was almost certainly messier than any list of species names can capture. Populations shading into one another, mixing at the edges, varying wildly from valley to valley, defying the neat boxes we build in hindsight. And that messiness opens a door onto something even stranger than a misfiled species stranger than anything we have met so far, because at least the big-headed people left bones we can hold and argue over. The next members of this family left no bones at all. We know they existed only because they are still hiding inside our genetic code, and we have never found a single one of them. Everyone in this story so far has had a body, a skull in a well, a finger bone in a Siberian cave, a metre-tall skeleton on an island, bones in a drawer. Even the most ghostly of them, the Denisovans, eventually surrendered a face. Now meet the ones who never will. The ones we have only ever met as a stain in the data. Populations of humans whose existence is real, whose genetic contribution to living people is measurable, and for whom we have never recovered a tooth, a bone, a fragment, a thing. Geneticists call them ghost lineages. The name is exact. Their presence is detected only by their effect, like a planet you cannot see, inferred from the wobble it puts in a star. Here is how you find a ghost. You take the genomes of living people and the genomes of the archaic humans we do have, Neanderthal, Denisovan, and you build statistical models of how all that DNA should fit together if the family tree were as simple as we drew it. Then you look for the places where the data refuses to fit, stretches of genetic code that are too strange, too old, too different to have come from any known source. When those anomalies cluster into a coherent signal, you're looking at the fingerprint of a population that mixed into our ancestors, a population that, by every other measure, has vanished without trace. And the signal is there, more than once. When the Denisovan genome was first read closely, there was something odd buried in it, a sliver that looked far more ancient than Denisovans themselves should be, a hint that the Denisovans had, in their own deep past, mixed with something much older still, a super-archaic population, in the field's language. Based on the divergence times in the genome, a plausible candidate is a late, lingering branch of Homo erectus, that 2 million-year traveller from early in this story, surviving somewhere in Asia long enough to encounter the ancestors of the Denisovans and leave a few lines of code in them. The ghost was not just in us. The ghost had a ghost of its own. And then the story did something nobody expected. It came home to Africa. For a long time, the casual version went like this. The interbreeding all happened outside Africa after the Great Migration, which is why people of fully African descent carry little or no Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA. Then, in 2020, researchers at UCLA examined the genomes of several West African populations, the Yoruba, the Mende and others, and found something that did not belong to any known relative. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something else. An archaic population whose ancestors appear to have split away from our line before Neanderthals and modern humans even diverged from each other, and which then, much later, mixed back in. By their estimates, somewhere between 2 and 19% of the ancestry of those modern West African populations may trace to this unknown, unnamed, never found kind of human. That quietly rearranges the entire story you've been hearing. Based on this signal, the mixing was not a special event that happened once, to one branch, on one frontier outside Africa. It looks instead like something that happened on multiple continents, in multiple eras, with the ancestors of living people absorbing other kinds of human, including kinds we have never laid eyes on and may never identify. Africa, the place we like to picture as the single clean wellspring of our species, has its own ghosts woven through it. There was no pure source. There was never a pure source. The mixing goes all the way down and all the way back, further than the oldest bone we have ever found. This is the deepest layer of the whole story, and it is worth saying as plainly as possible. We are not a species with a few exotic genetic souvenirs picked up from two famous cousins. We are a confluence at every level we are able to look. Neanderthal, Denisovan, the super archaic shadow inside the Denisovans, the unnamed ghost inside West Africans, and almost certainly others whose signal is still too faint to resolve with the tools we have today. Every time the methods sharpen, the family does not get simpler. It gets more crowded. The pattern of this entire field for 170 years has bent in exactly one direction. There were always more of them than we thought, and they are always more a part of us than we wanted to believe, which is the truest possible doorway into what all of this has been pressing toward. Forget now the tidy image of one species marching out of Africa to replace all the others. The boundaries were porous before we left. They were porous after we left. They were porous in places we have not even located yet. So the real question was never how the humans stayed separate. They didn't. The question is what actually happened when they met. In the flesh. On the ground. On the day the roads crossed. For a long time, the moment of contact was told as a single dramatic image, and the image was almost always violence. Our ancestors stride out of Africa, technologically superior, and the other humans fall before them like the losing side of a war. Replacement. Conquest. The strong erasing the weak. It is a very human way to tell the story, because it is the story we tell about ourselves constantly. It also turns out to be, at best, a fraction of the truth, and at worst a projection. Start with what we now know with real precision, because the precision itself is recent and remarkable. For years, the timing of interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals was a wide, fuzzy band, somewhere in a range tens of thousands of years across. Then, in December 2024, two studies, one in Science, one in Nature, closed in on it using the oldest high-quality modern human genomes ever sequenced, including individuals who lived around 45,000 years ago. The picture that emerged is far sharper than anyone expected. The bulk of the Neanderthal DNA that nearly every non-African person alive carries traces to a single, sustained period of mixing, beginning roughly 50,000 years ago and lasting on the order of 7,000 years. Think about what that sentence actually says. This was not one rare, furtive encounter in a cave. It was not a single act. It was a sustained genetic exchange that played out over roughly 7,000 years, longer than all of recorded human history. And every living person whose ancestry runs outside Africa descends from the population that lived through that long entanglement. We are, in the most literal genetic sense, the children of that contact, not its conquerors, its offspring. The same studies sharpened something else, something that quietly anchors the whole timeline, because the interbreeding clusters in that window, the main migration of modern humans out of Africa now looks to have been essentially complete by around 43,000 years ago. The genetics of our cousins are now helping us date our own departure. The lost humans are not just a story we tell, they are timekeepers in our own. And then there is Tinchamet Cave, which we touched earlier and now have to face directly, because it goes harder at the violent story than anything else. In the hills of central Israel, in a cave where the sediment had hardened almost to stone, researchers found burials dating to around 100,000 years ago, and the findings, published in 2025, describe something the conquest narrative has no slot for. In that region, in that window of roughly 130,000 to 80,000 years ago, modern humans and Neanderthal-like humans were not just coexisting. They were, the evidence suggests, sharing a way of life, the same tool-making approaches, the same use of red ochre. The dead lay to rest in the same postures, with the same kinds of objects, in patterns the researchers describe as a unified cultural set across hominin groups. Two different kinds of human, in the same region, apparently learning from each other how to make tools, how to hunt, how to honour a body. Not a frontier of war, a frontier of exchange. So what actually happened when the roads crossed? The real answer is the one this keeps coming back to. All of it, in different places, at different times, in different proportions. Somewhere, there was almost certainly conflict. We are not a gentle species, and there is no reason to think any of them were saints either. Somewhere, there was cooperation, shared fires, shared knowledge, shared graves. Somewhere there were children, many children, over thousands of years, enough to write a permanent record into the genome of nearly everyone outside Africa, and a separate record into the peoples of Asia and the Pacific from the Denisovan side. There was probably disease moving in both directions. There was probably indifference, two bands seeing each other across a valley and simply moving on. There was, in short, the full range of what happens whenever two human populations meet, because that is what these were, human populations meeting. The thing the old story got most wrong was its certainty. It was so sure we arrived as a separate superior thing and ended them as a separate inferior thing. The evidence says the boundary was porous from the start, that we were close enough to share tools and symbols and beds, close enough that the line between them and us was not a wall but a smear, and that the smear is still inside our cells. Whatever replaced the Neanderthals, it was not a clean external enemy. To a real degree, it was a slow merging, and the thing it merged into was partly them. Which brings us at last to the question this entire video has been circling from the first minute. If contact was not a clean conquest, if we did not simply outfight them, then why are we the only ones still here? Why did every other branch of this crowded family end, and ours, alone, continue? Here is where a lesser story lies to you. It tells you we won because we were smarter or stronger or chosen, and it sends you away feeling good. This is not going to do that, because the real answer is more interesting than the flattering one, and the first thing it requires is admitting how much we do not know. We do not fully know why we are the only ones left. Anyone who tells you they have the single clean reason is selling something. What we have instead is a set of pressures, each one real, none of them sufficient alone, combining differently for each species in each region. Let us walk through them honestly, and then say the part almost nobody says out loud. There is the question of networks. Based on the spread of materials in the archaeological record, modern human groups appear to have maintained connections across longer distances than the other humans did. Materials, and probably information and people, moving between bands separated by hundreds of kilometres. The other humans tended towards smaller, more local, more isolated groups. There is technology, but not in the crude way the conquest story means it. It is less that our tools were simply better, and more that our toolkit was more varied and changed faster, adapted more quickly when the environment shifted. In a world lurching between climate states, the ability to retool fast is not a luxury. It is the difference between a band that adjusts and a band that does not come back from the winter. There is symbolic thought and language. The Neanderthals had symbolic behaviour. Tinshemet and a dozen other sites make that undeniable, and the old claim that they had no inner life has collapsed. But it is possible our systems of language and symbol were more flexible, more able to carry complex plans and abstract agreements across distance and time. Possible, not proven. Honesty demands the qualifier, and I would rather give you the qualifier than the clean lie. There is disease running both ways, as the Neanderthal DNA in your immune genes silently testifies. Populations meeting and exchanging pathogens neither side was prepared for, with the larger, more connected population better able to absorb the losses and keep going. There is climate. The late Ice Age did not have one weather. It convulsed. Long cold snaps, abrupt swings, regional collapses. A large, interconnected, far-flung population can lose whole communities to a bad century and refill the empty land from elsewhere. A small, isolated one that loses its only community loses everything. And now the part the flattering story will never tell you, the part you should carry out of this video. We were probably not the strongest human species. We were not. The Neanderthals were physically more powerful than us, better armoured against cold, veteran survivors of ice ages we never personally faced. Homo erectus was more geographically successful than we were for almost the entire span of their existence, and they lasted 6 or 7 times longer than we have so far. The Denisovans held ground, the roof of the world that would still kill most of us. By the obvious metrics of strength and toughness and endurance, we were not the apex of this family. On several of those metrics, we were arguably the soft option. So if it was not raw strength, what was it? The best current answer is unglamorous, and the more you think about it, profound. It may simply have been connection. We may have been the most networked, the best at building and maintaining webs between groups, webs along which knowledge and tools and genes and help could travel. And the latest genetic work on the Neanderthals from the last 2 years sharpens this almost cruelly. Study after study now points to the Neanderthals suffering from chronically low genetic diversity and small, fragmented, often inbred populations. Work reading the shape of their inner ear, their mitochondrial lineages, their genomes, all telling a similar story of a people spread thin, locally going extinct and being recolonized, never able to build the deep reserves a large connected network provides. Recent modelling work has even shown mathematically that you would not need a war. A steady trickle of modern humans into Neanderthal groups, generation after generation, could by itself dissolve them genetically into us within a span of millennia. No conquest required, just contact and a difference in numbers and connectedness, running long enough. That, based on what we have, is what survival may actually have looked like when you strip the heroism off it. Not a stronger creature defeating weaker ones, a more connected one outlasting more isolated ones, not by winning a fight, but by being harder to fully kill, because we were never all in one place, never all dependent on one valley surviving one winter. When a Neanderthal band died in a bad year, that knowledge, those genes, that lineage could simply end because there was no wider web to carry it onward. When one of our bands died, the web held. Something flowed back in. It is a humbling thing to learn about your own species. We're not here because we were the best. We're here, in significant part, because we were the most networked, and because, when we met the others, the line between fighting them and absorbing them was never as sharp as our myths require. We did not stand over the human family as its conqueror. We are the branch that happened to be plugged into everything at the moment everything else got cut off. And the reason that distinction matters so much, the reason it changes the entire meaning of this story, is what it implies about the others. Because if we absorbed, rather than simply replaced, then extinct was never the honest word. And that is the last thing this story has to tell you. The textbook gives you dates, and the dates look like endings. The Neanderthals, gone, roughly 40,000 years ago. The Denisovans, gone, somewhere in the range of 30 to 50,000 years ago, with that stubborn rib on the Tibetan plateau pushing the youngest of them down toward the more recent edge of that window. Homo floresiensis, gone, around 50,000 years ago. Homo naledi, gone, 250,000 years ago. The big-headed people of Eastern Asia, gone. Each one with its tidy terminal date like tombstones in a row. But run everything you have heard tonight back through those dates, and the word gone stops fitting. The Neanderthal variants steering 47 traits in living people are not gone. The cluster of immune sensors, riddled with archaic ancestry, that helped our ancestors survive the diseases of a new continent, is not gone. It is doing its job in bodies right now. The stretch of Neanderthal DNA that changed who needed intensive care in a pandemic 4 years ago is not gone. The Denisovan gene that lets an entire people breathe on the roof of the world is not gone. It is in the blood of every Tibetan child being born this year. These are not fossils. They are not memories. They are operating code running today inside living humans. So we need to be precise about what we actually mean when we say these species went extinct. We do not mean their information was destroyed. We mean something narrower and stranger. They stopped existing as distinct populations. They stopped being separable from everything around them. The boundary that made them a them dissolved. But what was inside the boundary did not all vanish when the boundary did. The adaptations they spent hundreds of thousands of years evolving, the cold survival, the altitude survival, the immune defences paid for in their blood, in their winters, on their plateau, that did not die with the last distinct individual. A great deal of it was already on the other side of the line, inside the population that continued. It was absorbed. It was carried forward under a different name. Ours. There is a word for a document that has been written over older documents, where the earlier text was scraped away but never completely, so that under the new writing the ghost of the old writing still shows through. The word is Palimpsest. That, the genetics now show, is what a modern human is. Not a clean, pure, original lineage. A palimpsest. The latest layer of writing on a surface that was written on many times before, by other hands, in other ages, and if you hold us up to the right light, in the lab, in the genome, the older script is still legible underneath. This is the quiet revolution that the last few years of science have delivered, and it is why this story does not end where the old one did. The Neanderthal who shivered through an ice age in a European cave 40,000 years ago who was carried by his people because his arm had withered and he could not feed himself, he is not simply gone. Something of what his lineage was is in the immune system of someone who will catch a cold this week and never know they are running, in part, on his inheritance. The Denisovan on the frozen plateau, hunting blue sheep in air too thin for the rest of us, a creature whose face we only saw last year, pulled out of plaque on the teeth of a skull hidden in a well. Something of what they were is in the lungs of a person climbing toward a mountain pass at this very moment, breathing easily, never knowing whose breath they borrowed. They were told to us as extinct humans. The genetics have quietly reclassified them. They are not extinct in the way we were taught. They are unaccompanied, no longer walking beside us as distinct people, because they are no longer distinct. They came inside instead. The aloneness we think we feel as the last human species was never as complete as it looked because the others did not all leave. Some of them just stopped being a separate word and became part of the word us. And that reframes the very last thing there is to say. About that aloneness, about the moment it began, and about the individual nobody recorded who was the last of their kind. Somewhere on the Eurasian landmass, at the very end of the long ice age, the last Neanderthal was born. We do not know where, and we probably never will. We do not know the year, only the approximate band of millennia. We do not know whether it was a man or a woman, whether they lived a long life or a short one, whether they ever in their existence laid eyes on one of us. One of the new people, the tall, narrow ones from the warm south who had been trickling into the world for thousands of years. We do not know if they understood what was happening. There is no reason to think they did. Extinction is not an event you can see from inside it. There is no last day with a sky that looks different. There is just a person, in a landscape, who happens to be the final carrier of a way of being human that had endured for nearly 400,000 years, and who almost certainly died without the faintest idea that the line ended with them. The same must be true, somewhere, for the last Denisovan on the plateau, for the last of the small people on the island, for the last of whoever it was that carried bodies into the dark of the rising star cave. Each of these vast, ancient, competent ways of being human came down, at the end, to one individual, in one place on one ordinary day, who was the last, and not one of them knew it, and not one of them was recorded, and not one of them got a single line in any history, because no one who could write existed yet to write it. By around 40,000 years ago, the arithmetic was finished. No distinctly Neanderthal person was alive anywhere on Earth. The same became true of the Denisovans, of the people of Flores, of every other branch of the human family but one. The bush that had been so crowded for 2 million years was pruned, in the end, down to a single living shoot. And so, for the first time, we were alone. There was no one to look across the valley at, no other kind of mind to wonder about, no other kind of human to fear, or trade with, or learn from, or grieve. The Earth, which had belonged to a plural humanity for almost its entire human history, now belonged to one. We have lived in that solitude ever since, and we have lived in it so long and so completely that we forgot it was ever any other way. We built an entire idea of what human means around the accident of being the only ones, as if singularity were our nature, when it is really just our recent and strange condition. But here is the thing this story has been walking toward from the skull in the well, and it is the only honest place to leave you. The aloneness was never total. It only ever looked total from the outside, from the level of bodies and species names and the tidy terminal dates in the textbook. Go down a level, into the cell, into the genome, into the immune system mounting its defense and the blood adapting to thin air, and the others are still in the room, not as ghosts, as working parts. The encounters that happened before history, before farming, before writing, before any human could record what had occurred between two peoples meeting on a cold frontier, those encounters did not end when the bodies did. They were copied forward. They are being read out right now in cells inside the person watching this. If that person's ancestry ran through the world the others ruled, you are, to a small and real and measurable degree, the place several vanished kinds of human went. You are where they did not entirely end. So the standard story, one species rose, conquered, and replaced all the rest, and stood alone as the victor, is not just bleak. On the evidence we now have, it is wrong. We did not replace the human family and stand over it. We are what the human family turned into when several of its branches, over tens of thousands of years, in conflict and in cooperation, and in the simple, ordinary intimacy that produces children, flowed back together and became something none of them had been on their own. We are not the last pure human. There is no such thing. We are the confluence, the place the channels rejoined. That is why this is not a conclusion. It is an opening. Because every year now, the laboratories find more. A skull misfiled for 50 years turns out to be the face of a ghost. A smear of ancient plaque gives up a genome no one thought could be read. A new species is argued into existence from bones nobody had looked at twice. A cave in Israel rewrites how close we stood to the others. The map of the human family is not finished. It is being redrawn, actively, in our own moment, and the direction it keeps moving is always the same. More crowded than we thought, more connected than we thought, the boundaries blurrier, the them closer to the us than we ever wanted to admit. We were not the first humans. We were not, for most of our existence, the only humans. We are simply the ones who are still here to tell it. And we can only tell it now because we finally learned to read the others, where they had been hiding the whole time. In a well, in a finger bone, in a third of a size brain at the bottom of a cave, and in the blood of nearly everyone who will ever hear these words. The last human species was not the sole survivor of the others. The last human species is partly made of them. And somewhere out there, in the ground, in a drawer, in a fragment no one has run through the right machine yet, the next one of them is still waiting to be found.